Alright guys, I'm going to try and edit this as quickly as possible. We have an adjustment layer over the video that we're going to edit, and we're going to color grade it. So I'm going to select it, and first thing we're going to do is white balance. So here we can use the Vectorscope. This is the yellow and blue axis, or orange and blue. This is the green and magenta, so that corresponds to these two. If the image is supposed to be more blue, it will go towards the blue side, but if the image is balanced, it should be in the center. So just kind of use this as a guide, sort of, if you need. But we can just look at the picture and drag this to the orange, or better yet, we can click the number, use the up and down arrow keys for fine tuning, make it a bit more orange. And then let's see if I want to add some, let's see, this looks a bit more green than purple, so let's add a bit purple. Looks good there. So after white balance, the next thing you want to do is generally your tonal contrast. And here you can increase the shadows or decrease them, and the highlights, depending if you want a contrasted kind of image or an image with low contrast. Usually if it's high contrast, you can dim it down, but if it's on low contrast, you can boost it up. So here we're just going to take a look and increase the contrast first. I just like to bring out a lot of detail from object to object, so bringing in contrast brings a bit more detail along these rocks and stuff, and where the sky meets the ground. Exposure kind of changes the whole thing. You could see this, this corresponds to this whole image, and you can see that the image is generally in the brighter end on the top region as opposed to the bottom. So we can actually drop the exposure and see what that looks like. And ideally you want it kind of in the center, but just the same with this graph. If most of your stuff is indeed bright, you can keep it like towards the top, but just so it's not too bright, you can maybe drop it down by -0.1. And then there just aren't a lot of shadows in here, so that's probably why this region's kind of empty, and that's fine. It just is what it is. Let's see if we can drop the whites down. This whites affects the topmost region of here, and then the highlights just underneath it, and then the shadows right here, and then the blacks all the way at the bottom. So drop the highlights down as well a little bit. Shadows, hard to tell because we don't have a lot of shadows right now. We can move to this part of the video with more shadows hopefully, and see if we can add a bit of contrast with the shadows. So that's raising it, dropping it, dropping it. I feel like it's getting a bit dark, so let's keep it there. And the blacks, sometimes you just drag it left and right, see what it does, whatever you like. I like that. Just a little bit higher, because this brought down the darkest of regions a little too dark, and then bring it back up with the blacks. That's all of these. There's saturation here, but generally I like to play around with this one because it's right next to Vibrance, and I like to do those at the same time. So now that it's tonally contrasted, we're going to increase the saturation and Vibrance so that the colors kind of separate from each other a bit more. And a tip I heard recently is do more Vibrance than saturation. So Vibrance first and then add a bit of saturation. In the past I've always done saturation first and then Vibrance. To me it kind of looks the same. They say Vibrance gives a bit more natural look, so we're going to go with that for now. So after a certain point, colors pop out too much. You could see it kind of introducing a bit of artifacts there. So right there should be good. And then if we add a bit of saturation, ooh, that's colorful grass. So a trick here is to do a little bit too much saturation until the first thing blows up, and then you tone down that first thing, and then everything else should be kind of even. And then you can raise the saturation more if you need to. So let's go with this for now, and then we go to curves. What we can do is tone down this this green region. So what I like to do here is go to the saturation curves and create a point, an anchor point along this whole circle by clicking all these little circles. And then this green yellow corresponds to this green yellow kind of thing sticking out here, and this color rotation matches this color rotation, though the red here is at 12 o'clock and it's like 11 here, so it's a little off. But basically what I do is I look at this graph while changing these anchor points and see if I have the right color. So I can see that I've created this huge sliver, this empty sliver in this region, and that indeed does kind of correspond to the area that I'm looking at. But it's only the yellows of the area, not the greens, so it's still there. And you can see the yellows kind of went to gray, and that's what happens when you suck the saturation out of just the yellows. So we're going to bring it back up. Too much. Okay. There we go. And then we can bring the greens down a little bit, and you can see it bring down that spike. Too much. And then maybe the darkest of greens. And you can even see if it is indeed affecting it. So if you drag it all the way down or up, you could see if it's changing anything in your image. If that color's not present, it's not going to change much. This is actually pretty color specific, so it's really just these two anchor points that really affect it. Yeah, especially this one. So there we go. That's a bit more balanced. Still very saturated, but it's just about as saturated as the sky, as I would say. You can take a look at this graph and try not to pass this border. It's kind of a guideline. I don't even like to get near it, quite honestly. Just about as close as I'll go. Another tip is to record in low sharpness if you intend to increase sharpening in post. But if you don't intend to increase sharpening in post and you want sharpness, just set it to medium. You can't really go backwards and record in high and then drop sharpness. It just looks bad. So I record in low sharpness, so I usually add only about like 17, 20 points of sharpness. Here's LUTs. I don't really like using LUTs, but some people like it. And then you can see the preview here. You can even scroll through different LUTs and then change the intensity depending on if you like that LUT or not. But if you click it, it applies it. But Control Z. Let's see, and then curves. So, well, now that we've done white balancing, tonal balancing, and color saturation, we can go to the the curves. And before we actually color grade and add a bit of color to specific parts, we can take a look at the sun, which is one thing that tends to be overblown. Oops, not in. I want to go to this marker because it says the sun. And so I've already dragged the whites down here. If I bring it back to 0, you can see the sun kind of bloom back up. I'm going to bring it back to what I had. And then from here you can change the whites a bit more and really dial it in. Of course this affects the rest of the video as well, but considering there's not a lot of sun in the rest of the video and the ground should be fine. It doesn't have a lot of whites in it. But another thing you can do is actually, instead of changing it from here, I'm going to set that back, you can go to this white curve. It's already selected on white by default. Create 3 anchor points along this grid at each intersection, and then drag the top end, which corresponds to the whites, and that'll affect your sun as well. And this is a bit more fine-tuning than basic correction. Past a certain point, your sun will pretty much disappear into the clouds. So you don't want to go too far. And then, so that'll be your whites, highlights, mids, shadows, and blacks. So if I want to do the highlights, I'll drag this down a little bit. Usually I like to keep a nice curve so it's not some weird contrasty part. So that's for the whites, and you can do the same thing if you want to change individual levels of reds or greens or blues in the highlights, shadows, or midtones. But we're not going to go that far right now. We're going to go to color wheels for color grading. So these are your shadows, midtones, highlights, and you can start from, generally I have to start from shadows or highlights and then maybe adjust with midtones afterwards. But if I look at this picture, maybe the first thing I'll notice is that there's a bit of reds in the shadows. I might go to another scene. It doesn't have a lot of reds. That doesn't have a lot of reds either. I kind of like the balance of it. But if we go to here and we say drop the shadows reds, bring it away from the red to drop the red, so we go to teal, and you can see the image just becoming less red overall. If I bring back the center and go towards the red, it'll bring out reds in the shadows. So I usually try to aim for the balanced look, maybe work from there afterwards if I want to. And then, like, let's say I bring it away from the red, but I feel like it's a little green or a little blue. You can drag it away from the red and then away from the blue or away from the green. But I like to work with the main color that kind of sticks out first and then go from there. So let's say I wanted this image a little more towards the yellow and green side, right to the left. Nah, let's keep it there actually. And then highlights, let's say I want to bring out yellows from the sun or oranges, for like a sunset look or something. Totally not sunset, but a cinematic look is a blue shadows and orange highlights. That trick kind of works, so use it wisely. So I did the midtones, or the high shadows and highlights, and now I can do the midtones to kind of bring it all back in. Let's say I want it a bit more blue than all this. I can drag it to the blue. There we go. Because the highlights and the shadows kind of extends into the midtones, and depending how much you use of each one of the shadows and highlights, you can retune it with the midtones after. It's usually what I do. So here, maybe we can even add a bit more vibrance into this scene. That's not bad. But you just want to be careful if you change something for one part of the video, it applies to everything if you have it set up that way. If I cut this, then it'll only be one part of it, but right now it's just affecting the whole thing. I kind of like the way it looks. Let's see. Is that everything? Yeah, that's pretty much everything. So last thing before I forget is the export settings, because if you're going to do all this and make it look pretty, it's not really all that worth it if you don't export it with the right settings. So this was recorded in 30 FPS at 2.7K on the GoPro, and what you can do is go select the H.264 format and then preset. You can go to the 4K YouTube format as a starting point, and that'll give you a 4K resolution with you can change the frame rate. Checking this will match it to whatever you have it recorded at, which is fine, unless you're doing slow-mo. So let's say you recorded in 120, you slow it down by 4 times to 30 frames per second, right? Because 120 divided by 4 is 30. Then you want to export in whatever you've slowed it down to. The square pixels, high profile, and then, oh, that's my echo, and then the 5.2 level format, so for the highest quality. So now that we have that started, we can change it up a bit and render at maximum depth for just the best quality, the cost of time. VBR 2 pass versus 1 pass. You want 2 pass for the best whites and highlights. There's a lot of artifacting, or a little bit, in 1 pass, so I always select 2 pass, it takes a bit longer. And then YouTube has recommendations for what target and maximum bit rate that you're supposed to upload at for certain resolutions and frame rates. But I have the presets already set, so there's a 30 preset and a 60 preset. 30, whoops. So the 30 preset for bitrate is 44 and 56 for YouTube, and then for 60 frames per second it's 66 and 85. It's okay to go higher, but it just kind of takes up extra time. And that's pretty much it for this screen. And then if you are super sampling it to 4K from a lower resolution, you want to check this. But if you have it matching the resolution you recorded at, which is 2.7K, then you don't need this. In fact, you want it off because it's not going to scale at all. So, but if we're going to upscale to 4K, we're going to use maximum render quality. And then time interpolation, usually you want to stick with frame sampling or frame blending. Optical flow is generally for time stuff, like if you change the speed of your video, but I find that it introduces a lot of artifacts on the slow-mo. It's kind of weird. So I usually use frame blending even for slow-mo. And then make sure you have the right range to export selected. You want the whole sequence or however much you've selected in and out. And then you hit export. Hope this helps, guys. Let me know what you think. If you guys need any more help, ask questions, leave a comment, like and subscribe. See you.